Welcome to It Started With a Kick, the podcast in which well-known fans and high-profile figures from the football world talk to us about their first ever football match. I'm your host, Richard Foster, and I'm delighted to say today my guest is Darren Fletcher, the main commentator for TNT Sports for both the Premier League and the Champions League. Darren cut his broadcasting teeth, let's say, in local radio. Then he moved to Radio 5 Live, where he still hosts Friday Night Social. So, Darren, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Richard. Good to be here.
Great. And I appreciate making time in your ridiculously hectic schedule at the moment. So I think we'll just crack on with it, shall we? Can we just get you to talk about that first match that you went to, and then we'll delve into a few of the details.
Yeah, I mean, I got a bit of a sketchy start in terms of attending football matches. My parents split up when I was very young, and my dad, who I've not seen since I was 5, was a Derby County supporter. So I would probably think there might have been an occasion where I might have been taken there to the old baseball ground, but I wouldn't know. I can't remember that. I'm kind of arriving at this around the time that Forest were in European Cups. Clough was the manager. And there is one game that really sticks out. They played Manchester City on a Saturday afternoon. They were European champions at the time. I stood on a wooden stool that my granddad gave me, because my granddad used to take me because my dad wasn't around. So my granddad became my surrogate dad to all intents and purposes. Big football fan, big Forest fan, huge admirer of Brian Clough. So he used to stand me at the front of the Bridgeford end on his old kind of decorating stool, back in the day when you could take a stool in without people suggesting it might be an offensive weapon. And I used to stand right at the front and watch the match from down there. They played Man City. They won 4-0. Trevor Francis, who'd scored the winner in the European Cup final the season before, scored a hat-trick. But I think the most significant thing I remember about the game, because it didn't happen very often, John Robertson missed a penalty. And John never missed a penalty. No matter how big the situation was, you could bet your house that John was going to score the penalty. And he actually missed one. And it was at my end. I was stood literally right behind the goal, and Robbo took the penalty and missed it. So for all the genius that man had, the big thing that stood out was the fact that he actually failed. It failed that day. He didn't fail that day. He was still brilliant, but he missed something that he was automatic at. So that sticks out as a really memorable, very early game that I went to. And I look back on it now as a real privilege as a lad from Nottingham, that I was able to go and see that great team in action with those great players, some of whom have become friends now. Frank Clark lives in the same village as me, so I see Frank a lot. I see Gary Birtles a lot. I see John Robertson a lot. So they've kind of become friends as an adult, where they were these mythical figures as a kid. So it was a special time to be a football supporter in this city, in my city, and something that I'll always be very, very grateful of.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting you say that, for a start, John Robertson missing a penalty. I've actually tried to find out from club historians, from people around the internet, did he ever miss any other penalties? And no one's come up with it. So if he's a mate of you, could you ask him, actually?
I will.
You check with him that
Yeah.
was his only penalty miss, because I think he scored over 30 for Forest in his time. And I can envisage John Robertson's penalties, and no one ever got near them. I mean, he just popped them in the corner without any trouble. I think also it's interesting you talk about, your dad unfortunately leaving the family and being a Derby County fan, but your granddad being a Notts Forest fan. So that's an interesting pull between the two rivals, and the fact that Clough had been at Derby County himself.
For a start, we can't call them Notts Forest. I've got to say.
Oh, sorry, that was very bad of me. I'm really sorry. I know
Yeah,
It's an awful thing to say.
I know.
Sorry.
If I don't pull you up on that, I can't go out in my fair city again. No, I mean, in reality, my father failed twice, didn't he? Because he was a Derby County fan and he buggered off before he could do the responsible job of actually being a parent. So he failed me twice, but my granddad stepped in and did a wonderful job. And in reality, I wouldn't have changed it for the world. And he was the main reason, my granddad, why I became so football obsessed, because he was, and he lived for football. I've told this story before. He used to use Brian Clough as a potential punishment in the house, because Cloughie was this mythical figure back then. So if I was naughty as a kid, he would say, if you carry on doing that, I'll tell Mr. Clough. But it was always Mr. Clough, never Brian Clough or Clough. It was always Mr. Clough. A lot of respect in there. But he used to take me to football matches. He used to take me to all the games that I played in when I was a kid, and never missed anything. So what could have been a really big hole left behind was filled by him wonderfully. And the thing was, well, when I then started kind of jumping forward, when I started broadcasting, he was the proudest man in the world. He had a little radio, which is no longer with us now, but he had a little radio that I've still got in the house, and he used to sit there and listen when I commentated on Forest matches on the radio. Never missed a game in that regard. He'd sooner sit and listen to his grandson doing the commentary than actually being in the stadium, which was special for him, but even more special for me. And even now, I kind of honour his memory each year by the day of the Champions League final. I'll go to the broadcast position a little bit earlier than I normally would, and I just sit there for 15, 20 minutes and think about him, because without his support and his love of football and what he gave me, I wouldn't be sat there on that particular night. So that's always just a special part of my year, where I go and sit and think about him, and I suppose subconsciously thank him. And that's a ritual that I do on the night of the Champions League final. I don't do it any other time. I sometimes think about him. Well, I think about him a lot if I do a game at Forest and I'm stood on the gantry, because for obvious reasons. But that's just a little thing that I do in memory of him, and the important role that he played in supporting me to actually make something of myself.
Sure. So when, after that first memorable game against Man City, I mean, it's not a bad start, is it? You win 4-0, one of your players scores a hat-trick. Did he take you regularly from there? Or, I mean, how old you were, about 6 or 7 at that stage? Yeah. So did you start going regularly to the City ground, or was it just over a sporadic thing and then built up after that?
No, they used to have a great thing. I don't even know if they do it now, called the Junior Reds. And you could join the Junior Reds for about £1.50 for the year. And then if you remember the Junior Reds, there was a section in the main stand down towards the Trent end, where you would get cheap tickets. So I used to go and buy a ticket and sit in the Junior Reds, and he'd go and stand behind the goal, and we'd meet after, or he'd sit with me if he could get to. And we used to go a lot. I mean, through the 80s then, we went a lot. Some great times watching memorable matches back then. I mean, I remember being sat in the stadium when Forest were 2-0 down against Manchester United. They ended up winning 3-2 with a great free kick from Johnny Method. And then the next home match, 2 weeks later, they played Villa, were 2-0 down again. And Method scored a free kick to make it 2-2, and they went on to make it 3-2. So there were back-to-back 3-2 wins that both had almost identical Johnny Method free kicks. And I was also stood on my familiar little stool behind the goal the night he scored the 30-yarder against West Ham that just seemed to rise.
Oh, yeah.
And I was stood right behind the goal that night too. So I went a lot. I'll tell you something about Robbo, which is mad. And I'd never seen it. I mean, you might go, yeah, well, that's obvious, but I'd never noticed it. So, and John actually told me himself. So John would play on the left, and if you think about the great cross that he put in for Trevor Francis in 1980, that went right from the touchline to the far post, and Trevor comes in and ends up in the shot put circle. That's a left-footed cross. That's just about as good as you can hit a left-footed cross. But John was actually, he's 2-footed, but he was naturally right-footed. So John took all of the penalties with his right foot. So he played on the left and would put those wonderful left foot crosses in. but he took the penalties with his right foot. And if you think a year later, when he scored the winner in the Bernabeu against Hamburg, Bertels feeds him the ball and lays it back, and John scores with his right foot into the corner. So in 1979, he makes the winning goal with his left foot. In 1980, he scores the winning goal with his right foot. And as Martin O'Neill said in the I Believe in Miracles documentary, he was Ryan Giggs with 2 feet. And he was just, I don't think he ever gets the recognition. I think he's an all-time great of our game. He's certainly the best footballer that my club has had the privilege to have. And I think if you think about that 2 or 3 year period when Forest were as good as they were, he was as good as anybody in Europe at the time. He was there. He was the best player in the best team, and he was as good as anybody. Yet when anybody reels off the all-time great British players, he, for some bizarre reason, is absent from most people's lists. And he was unique in the way that he played. He was a difference maker every time he played. He was a wonderful footballer. He was such a good player to watch. You would look at him and say, he should be stood on the terraces rather than playing based on what he looked like. Aesthetically, he didn't look like a world-class footballer. But as Cloughy once said, give him a ball and a yard of grass and he becomes an artist. And that's the perfect way to describe him, I think, as an individual.
Yeah, I think it should be acknowledged, as you say, because I think he gets a little pushed to one side. And as you say, he was instrumental in that Forest side. And, as you know, not just setting up the goal for Trevor Francis and the European Cup final scoring. It was just everything seemed to revolve around. Maybe he was the first ever inverted fullback, the things we've got nowadays. We talk about Trevor Francis, and I just want to touch on Trevor because unfortunately he died about a year ago, but he had joined Forest and, of course, he was the first £1 million player. Everyone loves that press conference because, Trevor Francis in this brown suit with a kipper tie, but of course Cloughy turns up in his squash kit with a squash racket saying, come on lads, I've got to get off to the squash court. But he joined, and then this is about a year later that your game against Man City, but the impact he had is, again, probably more focus on Trevor Francis and John Robertson because of that goal, the fact he was a £1 million player. It's interesting, actually, when you look at it, the hat-trick that you saw is the only hat-trick he ever scored for Forest. He'd scored a hat-trick as a 16-year-old for Birmingham, but this was the only one he scored for Forest. And sort of sum up his career, because obviously he wasn't there for very long. It went slightly pear-shaped because he got injured and he was out for about 6 months. And then, ironically, he ended up at Man City. So, the first game you clearly remember, he actually ended up playing for that club. But tell me a little bit more about your impressions of him as, a young lad watching this £1 million player.
Yeah, I think in reality, it was the price that was the stunning aspect of Trevor in a Forest shirt until he scored the winning goal in the final. But don't forget, he couldn't play until the final. So we didn't see him as part of that great initial European run, the tremendous 3-3 on the mud bath at the City ground against Cologne, where Robbo actually scored a diving header, which must have been the only one that he did. But Trevor wasn't part of that, really. And Brian was very much, well, I've got him, but you'll play when I tell you you're going to play. I mean, when he made his debut for the A team on a Parks pitch, which has now got houses and a David Lloyd on it. So where the £1 million footballer first made his Forest debut is not even there anymore. The thing's gone and it's got houses on it. He snapped his Achilles tendon against Southampton, which left a big hole in what his Forest career would have been. Subsequently, then missed the 1980 final because of the injury. But he was a superstar, and this was a team that, let's not forget, over a 2 or 3 year period went from being promoted from Division 2 as the third place club to the best club side, arguably on the planet. And the fact they'd signed a guy for £1 million, it was just part of this ridiculous fairy story that was happening at the time. As a kid, I just presumed it would always be like this. and that Forest would always be winning European Cups.
Yeah.
I didn't foresee 3 decades out of the top flight by any stretch of that. But he was what I would say about Trevor. He was the total opposite to John. So Robbo was heavy, and everything he did was. I think you could almost set music to Robbo. You could put classical music to a John Robertson dribble and a drop of the shoulder and a cross, and it would fit perfectly. And then Trevor was more heavy metal, speed, purpose. Everything about him was like wow, because he would take your breath away with the ability that he had. But I think when you look back on that Forest team, his moment was the European Cup final. But there were so many good players around him at the time. Gary Birtle scored so many goals, big goals as a centre forward. Robbo was the best in the world at what he did. Kenny Burns was a footballer of the year. Peter Shilton was the best goalkeeper on the planet. Viv Anderson was outstanding as a right back. So right the way through the team, there were stars. So Trevor just became another one. And I always felt that team was a unit that was greater than the sum of its parts, even though they were really talented players. And that's where Brian was a master. And so I don't think it's the same as, let's say, Erling Haaland going to Manchester City, scoring 50 goals in his first season, blowing everybody away. Trevor became part of what that process was, which was, I think, the magic of the time. That Brian was just with Peter Taylor was just so good at spotting what he needed when he needed it, and then being able to put it into a group that was functioning perfectly well. So even though he's the most expensive player in the world, he didn't then automatically become Forest's best player. That was still John Robertson. So he always played second fiddle to him. But I think it would have been interesting had A, he'd been there longer, and B, that he didn't get the injury at the time that he did, because they missed him for a large period. Then when he came back, it was only weeks until he was sold to Manchester City at a time when they got to get some money in because they were starting to feel the pinch. So I think his time at Forest is an interesting time. Probably the most famous goal the club's ever scored was scored by him. The most famous transfer the club's ever made was him. But then when you analyse the time, there were so many people that could claim their own chapter at that period too.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I was amused to read that he actually, after certainly was at Birmingham and also I think his first season at Forest, in the summer he went off to play for Detroit Express. So you're thinking, can you imagine that now, where a player suddenly says, "Well, the season's over. I'm going off to play another season in America." Ridiculous. And also, I think we have to remind ourselves of that Forest team. As you say, they scraped promotion in 76, 77 by 1 point. And Bolton were the team who were in the box seat. They only won one of their last 4 games. So Forest really did scrape up by 1 point. And I think Blackpool were also only 1 point behind. So then to win the first division and then to win successive European Cups, that is the equivalent of Luton Town today, just scraping up through the playoffs, winning the Premier League today, and then going to win the Champions League successive seasons afterwards, and also throw in a couple of League Cups. It will never happen. It just isn't going to happen. So football, as we know, has changed massively, and this is, a long time ago. But I think you do have to almost sit back and try and take in the achievement that Brian Clough and Peter Taylor brought to the club, because you read it and you say, well, this is fantasy. This can't be real, because it was such an incredible achievement from pretty humble beginnings. And as you say, the players, they weren't necessarily particularly high profile apart from Francis, but they all fitted in, and, it's been well documented how it came about. I think also one of the other things that when I looked at the team sheet was Stan Bowles was playing, and unfortunately he died, very recently, last week. And he was another player. I know he didn't play for Forest for very long, but he, had been a brilliant player at QPR, and then came to Forest. And I know, having read about it, that he had a few run-ins with Brian Clough, because Brian Clough thought he was a bit of a, a show pony. So to see Stan Bowles in that team as well, which was, some of it was, the Larry Lloyds, the Kenny Burns, and then you had some of the flair players. And Bowles, as we know, was an incredible. In fact, I wrote a piece in The Guardian recently about George Best, and his last game for United was at QPR when Stan Bowles scored 2 goals. United lost 3-0, and Bowles was by far and away outshone George Best. So, there are all those interesting characters. So, when you're that young, did you actually appreciate that point in Forest history was so remarkable?
No, I just thought that's what they did. I mean, that's what they did. I mean, when you're that young and impressionable, I mean, if you're a Manchester City fan now, you just presume that this is how it's always going to be. I mean, it won't always be that case. Something will change. It always does. A Manchester United fan who was a young kid when Sir Alex was the manager just presumed they'd win Champions Leagues and league titles forever. It doesn't happen. Just going back to a couple of your points, I'll get to Stan Bowles in a second, but when you think about the group they had, the team that played in the second division and were only promoted because the result went their way at the end. It was either Wolves beating Bolton or Bolton beating Wolves. I forget which way round it was. And they were actually on a plane heading to Mallorca when they were told that they'd been promoted, that they even needed help to get out of the division, 3rd place, and then won the first division the year after. And they did make additions. So Shilton came in and others came in. But there were players, the day Clough arrived in kind of 74, you'd already got John Robertson, Tony Woodcock, Viv Anderson, etc. So there were players who were a bottom half second division club that played in a European Cup final. Tony Woodcock was on loan at Lincoln. Graham Taylor wanted to buy him. And it was only the fact he was playing as a midfielder at the time. And it was only the fact that he told Clough he wanted to have a bash at centre forward and did okay, that stopped him being sold to Lincoln. And then not long after that, he's a first division winner and a European Cup winner. So there are so many stories like that. I mean, Frank Clark was finished, part of the Newcastle team that won the Fairs Cup. Just somehow he gets into the team. Colin Barrett does his ACL that year, and Frank finishes his career by winning the European Cup. I mean, it's astonishing. I always say as well that people made a real song and dance, and quite rightly so, about Leicester winning the Premier League, and it was the greatest achievement this and the greatest achievement that. It paled, I think, into insignificance next to what Forest did. They needed to win that Premier League and then follow it up with a couple of League Cups and 2 European Cups to even get to that stage. So, and by the way, there was more finance behind what they did at Leicester at the time. This was a club that was on its knees financially and got by because they found talent, players that other people didn't want. So I think the story of them, what Forest did, I think it's the most remarkable story in English football history. I would defy anybody to find anything that would top 3rd place, First Division, League Cup, European Cup, League Cup. I mean, European Cup. It's astonishing. The fact they played a really good Ipswich team in a Charity Shield when the Charity Shield mattered, and I think beat them 5 at Wembley. I mean, it was just they were just taking really good teams to the cleaners. Liverpool couldn't beat them at the time. They got that how to play against Liverpool worked out, etc. So there were so many elements to it. But on Stan Bowles, of course, Stan famously didn't turn up for the flight for the European Cup final in 1980. So if you look at the respective benches that night, Forest had one less than Hamburg because they weren't squads back then. It was a travelling party. Stan didn't bother. He was on loan and didn't bother and didn't turn up for the flight. There are various myths as to why it was. What one idea was he didn't like flying, so didn't fancy it. Another story I've heard is it was some kind of dispute over not being able to play in a benefit game for John Robertson, and he was standing his ground. But whichever way you look at it, Stan was in the squad for the 1980 European Cup final against Hamburg and didn't turn up at the airport. So they left without him. Stan was never to be seen again in Nottingham. Another layer to this wonderful character that was the great Stanley Bowles. And he would have been involved that night against Hamburg, but he chose not to do it. And again, can you ever imagine that now, that somebody wouldn't go to a European Cup final for whatever reason, a Champions League final? He didn't do it.
No, I can't really ever envisage that happening. And reading about Stan Bowles and his, short time at Forest, apparently they can be apocryphal, these stories, but it sounds about right that either Clough or Taylor said to him, your job is to pass it to the fat fella, as in John Robertson. And you just think that is slightly undermining a brilliantly talented player, Stan Bowles, and also John Robertson, as you pointed out, the linchpin of this team. But
one memory I've got of Stan, by the way, in a Forest shirt, Richard, is that they played a game at the baseball ground against Derby, and the ball was kicked out by Shilton, and Stan was jogging towards the Derby goal, and the ball actually hit him on the back of the head mid-match. They made a big thing about it on ITV at the time. And then not long after that, it might have been the same passage of play, fouls committed and Frank Gray put a free kick into the top corner, but it all came about by the ball hitting Stan on the back of the head. So instead of looking at where it was coming from, he was looking where it was going to go to. And again, I don't recall that happening too often either. So, and that was at the time when Cloughy seemed to want to get a maverick in the team because he had Charlie George on loan as well, not long after that. So Charlie came and Stan came, and it was almost that he was looking for another ingredient. He'd got this great team and he got some great players, but all of a sudden, almost like he felt like he wanted a difference maker of some description. So he tried Stan and he tried Charlie George, and then they started to go down the route of breaking up the European Cup team and signing Ian Wallace and Justin Fashanu and Peter Ward and players like that, Asa Hartford for 5 minutes and stuff like that. It all changed very quickly. And if you speak to that group, they will all say that the only mistake that Brian made at that point was just to break the team up a fraction too quickly. They all felt they got a little bit longer, maybe one more year, just to do it slightly more gradually, but it all happened quite quickly. And then they went from being league champions, European Cup winners to relative also rans in the first division for a period of time until he generated his next really good team of Des Walker, Stuart Pearce, Neil Webb, Steve Hodge, etc. But it just went from brilliance to okay in probably too small a window, certainly for the players liking at that time.
Yeah, I think that points to the fact that, he had that nucleus, which didn't really have too many stars in it. And then, he sprinkles a little bit of stardust with Bowles or Charlie George or whatever. But when that nucleus begins to be broken up, that is a problem, because even if you've got some star players, you need the absolute, the kernel to be solid and robust. And as soon as they start to get a little bit old, long in the tooth, and you need to get rid of them, that is a difficult thing to do. And transitioning from, and as you say, they didn't have a lot of money, so they couldn't just go and splash out the cash and get replacements directly. So yeah, it's interesting to see the evolution of Forest, and also I think going back to that original match, City weren't a great team at that time. They were sort of lower mid-table. They just about sort of survived. I think they were 18th that season. But then you also had, and I'm sure you probably weren't aware of it because you were too young, but you had Malcolm Allison in the dugout opposite. And I don't know what you think about this, but I think there's also been a change in the culture of managers. And, managers now are very high profile. I'm not sure they were that high profile then. When you went to a match, you didn't really think about the manager. Someone like Clough, obviously, and Allison, flamboyant, gobby, whatever you'd like to call them. But they weren't the centre of attention as much as they are now. Do you think that's an interesting development? Do you think that's a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing?
I think it's a different thing. I mean, Brian Clough back then, I suppose, would have been one of the more vocal managers in game. But you very rarely saw Brian on the touchline. Brian did most of his work from the dugout. If you think about Malcolm Allison, Malcolm spent the majority of the match in the director's box. He didn't sit on the touchline, and a lot of managers did that then. And I think managers back then felt that they were doing their work in the week, and then they would give the responsibility to the players to carry out what they're doing. I find it slightly odd, I must say, having seen that evolution of from what managers were to what they are now, this absolute necessity, incessant shouting for 90 minutes, longer. I don't quite know whether that's the insecurity of the individual on the touchline, whether they've not worked hard enough in the week and they've forgotten a load of it that they've got to tell them there and then. Yeah. But I know that if I was doing my job and somebody was constantly for the entire match shouting instructions at me, I find it very difficult to do. And I don't know why they feel the need to constantly coach while the game's on. Surely you get to know your players when they're of a certain standard. They know what the job is. I can understand occasionally that you might need to point one or two bits out. But sometimes there can be three people stood there all shouting at the same time to different people. And I've got to say, look, it looks chaotic. I don't think it's a good look. I don't know how necessary it is. I kind of think it must be the insecurity of the individual that they don't feel they can either trust the people that are working for them. But we've had some great sides in the past, great teams. And there wasn't this incessant yelling and jumping up and down and charging around. I think in a way it must be distracting to a point because you're constantly having your attention taken by the guy on the touchline, whether you're doing right or wrong, and they're charging about. I think a lot of it's for show. I don't know what benefit there is. If you've got the best club side in the world and you're stood there and you've got to constantly shout instructions at your players, something has to be wrong somewhere else in the preparation process. I just don't see the necessity for it. I don't know whether managers these days feel that their profiles have to be higher, so they've got to justify their existence by jumping around. But I don't get it. I genuinely don't get it because I've seen the era where Bob Paisley would sit there stoically on the Liverpool bench. And I don't think they would have been any better had he been stood on the side of the pitch yelling like a madman for 90 minutes. I don't think Graham Souness would have been better. I don't think Kenny Dalglish would have scored any more goals. I don't think the Hansen-Lawrenson partnership would have been any stronger than it was. I just don't get it. I genuinely don't get it. I think you give people preparation, you then empower them to go and do their jobs, and you all reap the rewards together. I think it's overkill. Every now and again, fine. All the time, don't get it.
Yeah, and I think you touch on the key word there is trust. So as you say, you spend all that time with the players preparing, and let's face it, the preparation now is meticulous, and the analysis, and they've got all the data. So I think you're absolutely right. Why do you need to harangue players? I mean, sometimes it gets really aggressive, and it just seems odd because Clough was not someone to sit back quietly, but that's what he did during a game because he said, well, we set them up. Why do I need to give them any more instructions? So, Rich, I think you're right.
His view would be, I've signed you to do that.
Yeah.
If I send you on the pitch and you don't do that, I'll sell you and I'll sign somebody who will. He didn't feel the need to say to that individual constantly, do this, do this, do. He would say, this is your job. If you don't do it, somebody else will do it. He would never have felt the need to stand there and constantly. He'd tell you once or twice. He might give you a bit of help on the training pitch. But if you then weren't able to do what he's asking you to do, he would find somebody who would be able to do it. And I think Sir Alex was similar to a point. If you think about the teams that he had, he spent a long time sat on benches rather than stood on the edge of technical areas that we see now. I understand it. If you're a small team against a big team and you're going to get absolutely pumped and you just can't get the information into the players, and if you can, they probably can't carry it out anyway, then I can kind of forgive the need to, for 90 minutes, be reminding everybody what they need to be doing because they just can't absorb what you're saying. But if it's Man City against Arsenal, I just don't see. I don't see how you're helping, if I'm honest.
Yeah. One other thing I'd like to look at is the sort of aesthetics, going back to your first games, and particularly the Forest Man City game. the aesthetics of it, because I think that's really important, because when you go to a game, it suddenly impresses upon you, this is something completely different to anything I've experienced. I don't know, because I know you're a Nottingham man, so you might have been to see a cricket match or whatever, and whether that's a comparison. And just the idea of kits for me is really important. That Forest kit is, on that day is pretty much what it is now. So you got the Garibaldi red, the white shorts.
Well, it's on my wall. You can see it over the shoulder. That's the thing, which is signed by the whole group, which is, well, it's a treasure that will never leave my house or my family. No. That will be there forever. The kits were significantly better. They were more subtle. They didn't have stuff all over them. The kit manufacturer didn't try too hard. That's why there's such a market for people to buy classic shirts, because they're better than the ones that we've got now. I'm actually quite pleased this year that the Forest have gone back to Adidas, and the kit they've got this year is very similar to the one behind. It's got a round neck instead of a V-neck, but everything else is pretty much the same, apart from the sponsor on the front. And Forest always do their sponsor deal quite late. So you have an opportunity at the start of the year to buy it without the sponsor. So most fans have got plain Forest shirts that look very similar to the one over my shoulder. So I thought the kits were better. I thought the teams looked better. One thing that is very different aesthetically is that police officers would all wear the high pointed hats. And they would all wear extremely long ankle length overcoats, football matches. And they were quite imposing figures at the time. You would see a police officer who looked way taller than everybody else because of the hat. He'd also look bigger than everybody else because of the overcoat. And I remember they were quite an intimidating sight. And people treated them in that way. There was a lot more respect shown to the police officers inside the stadium, I felt, back then, because they looked like people that you didn't want to get on the wrong side of, if truth be known. So that's kind of one thing that always... There was one guy that used to always kind of stand in front of where I was, and he was a very imposing man, but never seemed to involve himself in anything. Just his presence was enough at the time. And you kind of felt safe because he was there. So there was no real worry about anything. I found it much more good-humoured back then in the stadium. A lot of it was designed to entertain as opposed to abuse. I go to football grounds now and I wonder how people change so much. They can't live their lives like that Monday to Friday in their workplace. But then when they walk into a football ground, they become other people. And I've never really understood that. When I used to go and stand as a kid, it would be very rare that you heard that kind of stuff. The referee might get a bit of stick, but not to the level they get now. And I mean, we famously at the City Ground had the manager put a sign up on the pitch: "Gentlemen, please moderate the swearing. Thank you, Brian." And Clough didn't want bad language in his ground, and he would address the fans if that was the case. Can you imagine that now? I mean, we as a culture would consider the manager to be crazy if he tried to do that. But back then, that was commonplace, and I just felt the feeling was different inside the stadium. I wish in many ways I could take my son to a game back then to experience it. I felt the songs back then were clever. You know, people thought about it, and the songs were catchy, and they'd pick a song in the charts that had a nice rhythm to it. They'd modify the words around. There's enough of that anymore. Anyway, it just seems everything was a bit more creative back then. It was different. And I don't want to sound like an old fuddy-duddy. Well, yesterday was better than today. There's so much today that's better than before, but I think it was an entirely different experience than it is now. Completely different. I don't think even the game itself, the pitches are different, the game's played different, everything looks different. It is a different experience. It was a different experience back then. I don't think now you'd be comfortable as a parent or a grandparent putting your son or daughter at the front of the stand, and then you maybe stand 20 yards behind. You'd want to be right there because you wouldn't trust what might happen in the stadium. Where back then, everybody did it. Down the front was all the kids. All the grown-ups, depending on height, would filter back, and everybody was fine. And at half time, you might wander back to find dad or granddad and get a piece of chocolate or whatever and have a chat. And then you'd wander back down again and nobody had nicked your stool. That's where you were going to stand. And it was a really pleasurable experience. I think they could learn a lot in many ways about the experience that people have now. I think some things have changed for the better, but I think the overall feel of a match day I felt was much different.
Yeah, I feel, I was there myself many years ago. It felt not as synthesized as it is now. There is too much, the light shows, some of the stuff that goes on. You just think, I'm not sure I'm sort of enjoying this. I'm a Palace fan. I go to the halftime challenge and they've got, the crystals, the on the pitch. I'm thinking this isn't quite right. It's just been going on for a long time, and I just don't feel this should be happening anymore. But that's again probably me being a fuddy-duddy.